Lieutenant Sarah Martinez had always been told she was too small for combat duty. At 5 feet 4 inches and barely meeting the weight requirements, she faced constant doubt from her superiors. But what she lacked in size, she made up for in determination and an uncanny ability to think clearly under pressure. Her sharp brown eyes missed nothing, and her steady hands never shook, even when bullets flew overhead. The desert heat in the fictional Middle Eastern country of Khazara was unforgiving. Sarah wiped the sweat from her forehead as she adjusted her gear for the 100th time that morning. Her unit, the 23rd Infantry Division, had been deployed to this war-torn region 6 months ago. Their mission was to provide security for humanitarian aid workers and help establish safe zones for civilians caught in the crossfire of a brutal civil war. Sarah's squad consisted of 8 soldiers, each with their own story of why they enlisted. There was Sergeant Mike Johnson, a father of 3 from Ohio who joined to pay for his kids' college education. Private Rodriguez came from the streets of Los Angeles, seeing the military as his ticket to a better life. Corporal Thompson was a quiet farm boy from Kansas who rarely spoke but could shoot with deadly accuracy from over a kilometer away. The morning briefing had been routine. Intelligence suggested minimal enemy activity in their sector. They were tasked with escorting a convoy of medical supplies to a refugee camp 20 kilometers outside the capital city of Nazira. Sarah had run this route dozens of times before. The road wound through rocky terrain, past abandoned villages where families once lived normal lives before the war tore everything apart. As they loaded into their armored vehicles, Sarah noticed something different in the air. Maybe it was the way the local children weren't playing in the streets as usual, or how the market vendors seemed more nervous than normal. Her gut told her something was wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on exactly what. The convoy consisted of 3 vehicles. Sarah rode in the middle truck with 4 other soldiers, while Sergeant Johnson led the front vehicle and Corporal Thompson brought up the rear with the heavy machine gun. The medical supplies they carried could save hundreds of lives at the refugee camp, where doctors struggled daily with shortages of basic necessities like antibiotics and bandages. 30 minutes into their journey, Sarah's instincts proved correct. The world exploded around them in a deafening roar of gunfire and explosions. The lead vehicle disappeared in a cloud of smoke and debris as an improvised explosive device detonated directly underneath it. Sarah felt her truck lurch violently to the left as the driver fought to maintain control while bullets shattered the windshield. "Contact left! Contact left!" screamed Private Martinez over the radio, his voice barely audible over the chaos of automatic weapons fire. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from the rocky hills on both sides of the road. They had driven straight into a carefully planned ambush. The enemy had chosen their position perfectly, with high ground advantage and multiple escape routes. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She grabbed her rifle and returned fire toward the hillside, trying to provide covering fire for her squad mates. The truck finally came to a stop behind a large boulder that offered minimal protection from the incoming rounds. She could hear the distinctive crack of bullets passing just inches from her head. "Johnson, report!" she yelled into her radio, but received only static in response. The front vehicle was completely destroyed, flames licking at what remained of the armored shell. Through the smoke, she could see movement, but couldn't tell if anyone had survived the initial blast. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Thompson's vehicle had taken heavy damage to its engine and was immobilized about 50 meters behind them. She could see him setting up his machine gun position, but he was exposed and taking heavy fire from multiple directions. The enemy had at least 20 fighters positioned in the rocks above them, and more seemed to be arriving every minute. Sarah made a split-second decision that would change everything. Instead of staying in the defensive position behind the boulder, she decided to flank the enemy position. It was extremely dangerous, but staying put meant certain death for her entire squad. She grabbed extra ammunition and her medical kit, knowing that wounded soldiers were depending on her leadership. "Rodriguez," Lay down covering fire on the left ridge. Thompson, target the machine gun nest at 2 o'clock, she commanded through her radio while checking her weapon one final time. I'm going to move around to their blind spot and try to take out their command position. The plan was simple but required perfect timing and a lot of luck. Sarah would have to cover nearly 200 meters of open ground while under fire from multiple positions. The rocky terrain offered some concealment, but not much protection from high-velocity rounds. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and she would become another casualty of this brutal war. As Rodriguez opened fire with his automatic rifle, Sarah sprinted from boulder to boulder, using every piece of cover available. Bullets struck the rocks around her, sending sharp fragments flying in all directions. She could feel the heat from rounds passing close enough to singe her uniform. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her mind remained focused on the mission. Halfway through her flanking maneuver, Sarah came across Sergeant Johnson. He was badly wounded, trapped under debris from his destroyed vehicle. Blood covered most of his uniform, and his left leg was clearly broken. Despite his injuries, he was still trying to provide covering fire for his men with his sidearm. "Sarah, thank God," he gasped as she slid into cover beside him. "There are at least 30 of them up there, maybe more. They've got us surrounded. We need to call for backup immediately." Sarah quickly assessed Johnson's wounds while continuing to monitor the enemy positions. He had taken shrapnel to his chest and abdomen, and he was losing blood fast. Without immediate medical attention, he wouldn't survive much longer. But calling for a medical evacuation helicopter in the middle of a firefight was extremely dangerous for the aircrew. "Can you move?" she asked, while applying pressure to his worst wound. Johnson tried to stand, but collapsed immediately, his face pale from blood loss and shock. Sarah realized she would have to carry him to safety while continuing to fight off the enemy attack. The weight of command pressed down on her shoulders as she calculated their rapidly diminishing options. The enemy fire intensified as more fighters joined the battle. Sarah could see them moving to cut off any possible escape routes. They were professional soldiers, not the usual poorly trained militants her unit typically encountered. Their tactics were sophisticated, and they had obviously planned this ambush for weeks or even months. Through her binoculars, Sarah spotted the enemy commander directing his fighters from a position about 300 meters up the hillside. He was using hand signals to coordinate the attack, and she realized that taking him out might disrupt their organized assault long enough for her squad to escape or for reinforcements to arrive. Sarah made another difficult decision. She would have to leave Johnson temporarily while she attempted to reach the enemy command position. It went against every instinct she had as a soldier and a leader. But staying with him meant they would both die when the enemy fighters completed their encirclement. "Mike, I need you to stay conscious and keep pressure on that wound," she told Johnson while handing him her medical supplies. "I'm going to try to take out their leader. Rodriguez and Thompson are still in the fight, and backup is on the way." Johnson nodded weakly, understanding the impossible situation they faced. "Do what you have to do, Lieutenant. We trust you." Sarah began her ascent up the rocky hillside, using every bit of cover available while avoiding the enemy patrol routes. The climb was treacherous, made worse by the weight of her equipment and the constant threat of discovery. Several times she had to freeze in place as enemy fighters passed within arm's reach of her position. As she climbed higher, Sarah could see the full scope of the ambush. The enemy had positioned fighters in a perfect horseshoe formation, with overlapping fields of fire that covered every possible escape route. They had obviously studied American convoy procedures and knew exactly how to exploit their weaknesses. This wasn't a random attack. It was a carefully planned military operation. The enemy commander was positioned behind a natural rock formation that provided excellent protection while giving him a clear view of the entire battlefield. He was older than most of his fighters, probably a former military officer with extensive combat experience. Sarah could see him speaking into a radio, likely coordinating with other enemy units in the area. Sarah found a position about 150 meters from the enemy command post. It was closer than she would have preferred, but it was the best available given the terrain and time constraints. She could hear Rodriguez and Thompson still exchanging fire with the enemy positions below, but their ammunition wouldn't last much longer. Through her rifle scope, Sarah could see the enemy commander clearly. He was wearing a distinctive black beret and carried what appeared to be a Soviet-era sniper rifle. Around him, 4 other fighters provided security while maintaining radio contact with the assault teams engaging her squad below. Sarah controlled her breathing and steadied her rifle against a stable rock. The shot would have to be perfect. She wouldn't get a second chance. The distance was manageable, but the wind was unpredictable in the rocky terrain, and enemy fighters would immediately target her position once she fired. Just as she was about to squeeze the trigger, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. American attack helicopters were approaching, drawn by the sound of heavy combat. The enemy commander heard them too and began barking orders to his fighters. Some began preparing to withdraw while others set up anti-aircraft weapons. This was Sarah's moment. While the enemy was distracted by the approaching helicopters, she took her shot. The rifle kicked against her shoulder as the bullet traveled across the rocky landscape. Through her scope, she watched the enemy commander collapse, his distinctive black beret falling to the ground beside him. Immediately, the organized enemy assault began to fall apart. Without their leader's coordination, the fighters started making individual decisions instead of following a unified plan. Some began withdrawing to predetermined positions, while others continued their attacks without proper support. Sarah immediately began her descent back to Johnson's position, but she could hear enemy fighters moving to intercept her. They had figured out approximately where the shot came from and were converging on her location. She would have to fight her way through multiple enemy positions while the helicopters engaged targets below. The first enemy fighter appeared around a large boulder about 50 meters ahead of her. Sarah fired twice, dropping him before he could raise his weapon. But the gunshots revealed her position to other nearby fighters. She could hear them calling to each other in their native language as they moved to surround her. Sarah found herself trapped between 2 groups of enemy fighters with limited ammunition and no easy escape route. The helicopters were providing effective support for Rodriguez and Thompson below, but they couldn't help her without risking hitting her with their own weapons. She was on her own in a deadly game of cat and mouse among the rocky terrain. The next few minutes would determine whether she lived or died, and whether her squad would make it home safely. Sarah checked her weapon one final time and prepared for the fight of her life, knowing that everything she had trained for had led to this moment in the unforgiving mountains of Kazara. The first enemy fighter came around the boulder with his rifle raised, but Sarah was ready. Years of training had prepared her for exactly this moment. She fired 2 quick shots center mass, and the fighter dropped immediately. But the sound of gunfire revealed her position to the others searching for her. Sarah could hear voices getting closer from at least 3 different directions. They were speaking rapidly in Arabic, coordinating their search pattern. She estimated at least 8 fighters were closing in on her position among the rocky terrain. With only half a magazine of ammunition remaining, she needed to be extremely careful with every shot. The attack helicopters circled overhead like angry wasps, their machine guns chattering as they engaged enemy positions around Rodriguez and Thompson's locations below. Sarah could see smoke rising from multiple impact sites where the helicopters had destroyed enemy fighting positions. But up here among the rocks, she was too close to enemy fighters for the pilots to safely engage without risking hitting her. Sarah moved carefully through the rocks, trying to put distance between herself and the pursuing fighters while working her way back toward Johnson's position. Every step had to be calculated. One loose rock, one careless movement, and the enemy would pinpoint her location immediately. She found a narrow crevice between 2 large boulders that offered good concealment and a clear view of the most likely approach routes. From this position, She could see two enemy fighters moving methodically through the rocks about 70 meters below her. They were experienced soldiers, advancing with proper tactical spacing and using effective communication. Sarah waited patiently as they approached. Patience was often the difference between life and death in combat. The first fighter passed directly below her position, unaware of her presence above him. The second fighter was about 20 meters behind, providing overwatch for his partner. Sarah knew she would have to eliminate both quickly and quietly, if possible. As the lead fighter passed beneath a large overhang, Sarah dropped silently behind him. Her combat knife found its mark before he could make a sound. The second fighter was still scanning the rocks ahead, unaware that his partner had been eliminated. Sarah picked up the fallen soldier's rifle and checked the ammunition. A full magazine of 30 rounds gave her much better odds of survival, but taking down two fighters had cost her precious time. She could hear other enemy soldiers calling for their missing comrades. Soon they would find the bodies and realize exactly where she was hiding. Sarah needed to move immediately, but the terrain between her current position and Johnson's location was almost completely open ground. The sound of additional helicopters approaching from the east gave her hope. American reinforcements were arriving. Probably a full squadron of attack aircraft, along with transport helicopters carrying additional ground troops. But they were still at least 10 minutes away, and Johnson was running out of time. Sarah made another difficult decision. Instead of trying to reach Johnson directly, she would draw the enemy fighters away from his position by attacking them from an unexpected direction. It was extremely dangerous, but it might give the wounded sergeant a chance to survive until the reinforcements arrived. She moved east along the ridgeline, using the rocky terrain to mask her movement from the enemy fighters below. Her plan was to hit them from their flank while they were focused on searching for her in the original area. The maneuver would require her to cover nearly 400 meters of difficult terrain while avoiding multiple enemy patrols. 20 minutes later, Sarah reached a position that overlooked the main enemy rally point. About 15 fighters had gathered near a natural depression in the rocks where they had established a temporary command post after their original leader was eliminated. They were arguing among themselves about what to do next, their discipline beginning to break down without clear leadership. Sarah could see they had dragged their dead commander's body to this location, along with several wounded fighters from the helicopter attacks. One older fighter seemed to be trying to take command, but the others weren't responding well to his authority. This confusion gave Sarah a significant tactical advantage. From her elevated position, Sarah had clear shots at the entire group, but she knew that firing would immediately reveal her position to any other enemy fighters in the area. She would have to make every shot count and then move immediately before they could coordinate a response. Sarah steadied her rifle and began engaging targets methodically. Her first shot dropped the fighter who was trying to assume command. The second and third shots eliminated two fighters who were reaching for their weapons. By the time the remaining enemy soldiers realized where the fire was coming from, Sarah had already eliminated 5 of their number. The surviving fighters scattered among the rocks, seeking cover from the devastating, accurate fire coming from the ridge above them. Sarah continued firing at any target that presented itself, forcing them to keep their heads down while she repositioned to a new firing location. But her aggressive tactics had attracted attention from other enemy fighters in the area. Sarah could hear them approaching her position from multiple directions, called in by the sound of heavy gunfire. She estimated at least 20 fighters were now converging on her location from various points around the mountainside. The reinforcement helicopters were getting closer, but they still weren't close enough to provide immediate support. Sarah could see them in the distance, black dots against the desert sky growing larger by the minute. She just had to survive long enough for them to arrive and tip the balance of the battle. A grenade exploded about 30 meters from Sarah's position, sending rock fragments flying in all directions. The enemy had brought heavier weapons to bear and were trying to force her out of the rocky terrain onto more open ground. She could hear the distinctive sound of a rocket-propelled grenade being prepared somewhere below her. Sarah abandoned her current position just as another RPG round impacted the rocks where she had been hiding. The explosion left her ears ringing and covered her with dust and debris, but she was uninjured. She slid down a steep slope behind a series of large boulders, trying to put some distance between herself and the enemy's heaviest weapons. But sliding down the slope brought her closer to Johnson's position, which was both good and bad news. Good, because she could finally attempt to rescue the wounded sergeant, but bad because the enemy fighters were also converging on that same area. She would have to fight through their positions to reach him. Sarah could see Johnson about 100 meters away, still conscious but obviously weakening from blood loss. He had managed to drag himself behind better cover, but he was trapped and couldn't move any further without assistance. Enemy fighters were approaching his position from the south, apparently unaware that he was there. The sound of helicopter rotors was getting much louder now. Sarah looked up to see 2 American attack helicopters cresting the ridge, their weapon systems already engaging enemy positions below. The distinctive sound of chain guns filled the air as the pilots began systematic destruction of enemy fighting positions throughout the rocky terrain. But Sarah realized she was in a dangerous position. The helicopter pilots couldn't distinguish her from the enemy fighters at this distance, especially since she was carrying an enemy weapon and moving through the same terrain the fighters were using. She needed to signal her position immediately before becoming a victim of friendly fire. Sarah pulled out her signal mirror and began flashing the helicopters with reflected sunlight, using the standard recognition pattern she had learned in training. The technique was difficult to execute while under fire, but it was her only way to identify herself to the air crews above. One of the helicopter pilots noticed the signal and began circling her position. Through her radio, she could hear him calling for confirmation of friendly forces in the area. Sarah switched to the emergency frequency and began transmitting her unit identification and current situation report. Eagle 6, this is Bravo 47. I have 1 critically wounded soldier at grid reference. Sarah provided her exact location while continuing to move toward Johnson's position. The helicopter pilot confirmed her transmission and began adjusting his attack pattern to avoid hitting her or the wounded sergeant. With air support now aware of her position, Sarah felt confident enough to make a direct assault on the enemy fighters threatening Johnson. She could see 3 fighters moving through the rocks toward his location, apparently planning to capture or eliminate him before the helicopters could intervene. Sarah flanked the enemy group by moving through a narrow ravine that provided concealment from both ground observation and the helicopters overhead. The ravine brought her within 50 meters of the enemy fighters, close enough to engage them with accurate rifle fire before they realized she was there. Her first shots eliminated the lead fighter immediately. The second fighter turned to engage her, but was caught in the open without adequate cover. Sarah's next burst dropped him before he could bring his weapon to bear. The third fighter managed to reach cover behind a large rock, but he was now trapped between Sarah's position and the helicopter circling overhead. The helicopter pilot had been watching the engagement and immediately engaged the final enemy fighter with precise machine gun fire. The rocks around the fighter's position erupted in a shower of sparks and debris as hundreds of rounds impacted within seconds. When the firing stopped, there was no movement from the enemy position. Sarah immediately ran toward Johnson's location, keeping low to avoid any remaining enemy fighters in the area. She could see that his condition had deteriorated significantly during the firefight. His face was pale and his breathing was shallow. The makeshift bandages she had applied earlier were soaked through with blood. "Johnson, stay with me," Sarah said as she began applying fresh bandages to his wounds. "The cavalry has arrived. We're getting you out of here." Johnson managed a weak smile despite his obvious pain. "I knew you'd come back for me, Lieutenant. How did we do down there?" Sarah looked toward the valley where their original convoy had been ambushed. She could see Rodriguez and Thompson moving around their vehicles, apparently uninjured but checking for additional threats. The enemy force that had seemed so overwhelming an hour ago was now scattered and largely eliminated by the combination of ground action and air support. "Everyone made it," Sarah told Johnson as she prepared him for evacuation. "Rodriguez and Thompson are secure, and the medical supplies we were carrying survived the ambush. The mission was a success." The evacuation helicopter arrived 15 minutes later, a heavily armored medical bird with a full trauma team aboard. The medics took over Johnson's care immediately, starting IV fluids and preparing him for transport to the combat hospital. Sarah knew he would survive now. Military medicine had advanced tremendously, and soldiers who made it to proper medical care alive generally recovered fully. As the medical helicopter lifted off with Johnson aboard, Sarah finally had a moment to assess her own condition. She had taken several minor cuts from rock fragments, and her uniform was torn in multiple places, but she was essentially uninjured. More importantly, she had successfully led her squad through an extremely dangerous situation and brought everyone home alive. The reinforcement troops had arrived by transport helicopter and were now securing the entire ambush site. Intelligence teams were already examining the enemy weapons and equipment, trying to determine who had planned and executed such a sophisticated attack. The enemy commander's body and equipment would provide valuable information about their organization and capabilities. Rodriguez and Thompson approached Sarah's position, both grinning despite the day's violence. "Lieutenant, that was the most incredible thing I've ever seen," Rodriguez said. "You took out their whole command structure by yourself." Thompson, normally quiet, was more animated than Sarah had ever seen him. "The way you flanked that position and took out their leader was textbook perfect. They never knew what hit them." Sarah felt a mix of pride and exhaustion as the adrenaline from the firefight began to wear off. She had proven herself as a combat leader under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. But more importantly, she had brought her soldiers home alive, which was always the most important measure of success in military operations. The convoy mission would be rescheduled for the following week with additional security. The medical supplies would eventually reach the refugee camp, where they were desperately needed, and somewhere in a military hospital, Sergeant Johnson would recover from his wounds and return to his family in Ohio. But Sarah knew that this day would stay with her forever. It was the day she learned that leadership wasn't about being the biggest or strongest soldier. It was about making impossible decisions under pressure and accepting responsibility for the lives of others. Today, she had done both successfully. As the sun began to set over the rocky landscape of Kazara, Sarah climbed aboard the transport helicopter that would carry her team back to base. Tomorrow would bring new missions and new challenges, but tonight she could rest, knowing that she had passed the ultimate test of combat leadership. The helicopter lifted off into the desert twilight, carrying Sarah and her team away from the battlefield, where they had faced death and emerged victorious. Below them, the rocky terrain looked peaceful in the fading light, giving no indication of the intense battle that had taken place among the ancient stones. But Sarah would return to these mountains again. She was a soldier, and this was her war to fight until it was finished. 3 weeks after the ambush, Sarah sat in the military hospital waiting room, holding a small bouquet of flowers from the base commissary. The antiseptic smell reminded her of field hospitals she had visited during her deployment. But this place was different. Here, soldiers recovered and healed instead of fighting for their lives. Sergeant Johnson was sitting up in his hospital bed when she entered his room, looking much better than the last time she had seen him. His leg was in a cast, and he still had bandages covering his chest wounds, but his color had returned and his eyes were bright and alert. "Lieutenant Martinez," he said with genuine warmth, "I was wondering when you'd come visit an old wounded warrior." Sarah smiled and placed the flowers on his bedside table. "How are you feeling, Sergeant? The doctors say you're making excellent progress." Johnson shifted in his bed, wincing slightly from his healing wounds. "Better every day. They tell me I'll be walking normally in a few months. maybe even cleared for light duty by next year. Not bad for someone who took a face full of shrapnel. They talked for a while about his recovery, his family back home, and the letters he'd received from his children. Johnson's oldest daughter had sent him a drawing of him in his military uniform with the words, "My hero, Dad," written in crayon across the bottom. It was taped to the wall next to his bed where he could see it every day. "Sarah, I want you to know something," Johnson said, his voice becoming more serious. "What you did out there, the way you led us through that impossible situation, that was real leadership. I've served with a lot of officers over the years, and most of them would have stayed behind that boulder and waited for backup." Sarah felt uncomfortable with the praise. "I just did what needed to be done." "We're all trained for those situations." "No," Johnson said firmly. "Training is one thing. Actually doing it when people are shooting at you and your friends are dying, that's something completely different. You saved all our lives that day, and I'll never forget it." Their conversation was interrupted when Rodriguez and Thompson arrived for their own visit. Both soldiers looked clean and rested, a stark contrast to their appearance after the ambush. They had brought playing cards and magazines, planning to spend the afternoon keeping Johnson company. "Lieutenant," Rodriguez said, "have you heard about our new mission assignment?" Sarah hadn't heard any official word about their next deployment. After the ambush, their unit had been given 2 weeks of rest and recovery time while intelligence analysts studied the enemy tactics and equipment they had captured. She expected they would return to routine convoy escort duties soon. "The captain wants to see you this afternoon," Thompson added. "Word is they're putting together a special task force for high-risk operations. Apparently, someone up the chain of command was impressed with how you handled things out there." Sarah felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. Special operations meant more dangerous missions, but it also meant working with the best soldiers and having access to better equipment and intelligence. It was an opportunity to make a real difference in the war effort. After leaving the hospital, Sarah reported to Captain Williams' office at the appointed time. The captain was a career officer with over 20 years of experience, including tours in multiple combat zones. He was known for being fair but demanding, expecting excellence from every soldier under his command. "Lieutenant Martinez, please sit down," Captain Williams said as Sarah entered his office. "I've been reading the after-action reports from your engagement 3 weeks ago. Quite impressive work out there." Sarah remained at attention. "Thank you, sir. My team performed exceptionally under difficult circumstances." "At ease, Lieutenant," the captain said with a slight smile. "I'm not here to give you a formal evaluation. I'm here to offer you an opportunity that doesn't come along very often." Captain Williams explained that Higher Headquarters was forming a new unit specifically designed to handle high-value target operations and emergency response situations. They needed experienced combat leaders who had proven themselves under fire and could think independently in chaotic situations. "The missions will be dangerous," the captain said bluntly. "You'll be going places other units can't go and doing things other units can't do. But you'll also have the best equipment, the best intelligence, and the authority to make decisions in the field without waiting for approval from Higher Headquarters." Sarah listened carefully as the captain described the new unit's mission and organization. It would be small, maybe 30 soldiers total, with teams of 6 to 8 members each. They would work directly with special operations forces and intelligence agencies, often operating independently for weeks at a time. "I'm recommending you for team leader position," Captain Williams said. "You'll be responsible for training and leading a team of specially selected soldiers on missions throughout this region. Interested?" Sarah didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir. When do I start?" The captain handed her a thick folder containing classified briefing materials. "Report to the Special Operations Compound tomorrow morning at 0600. Your first mission briefing is at 800. And Lieutenant, congratulations. You've earned this opportunity." The next morning, Sarah arrived at the Special Operations Compound to find a completely different world from the regular Army base. The facilities were state-of-the-art, with advanced training simulators, specialized weapons ranges, and equipment she had only heard about in classified briefings. The soldiers she saw were obviously elite troops, moving with confidence and purpose. Her new team was waiting in the briefing room when she arrived. 5 soldiers, each with extensive combat experience and specialized skills. There was Staff Sergeant Davis, a demolitions expert who could handle any type of explosive device. Sergeant Foster was a communications specialist who spoke 3 languages fluently. Corporal Williams was a medic with advanced trauma training. Private Kim was a technology specialist who could operate the latest surveillance and reconnaissance equipment. The 5th member of her team surprised her completely. It was Thompson, the quiet farm boy from Kansas who had proven himself during the ambush. He had volunteered for the new unit specifically to continue serving under her leadership. "Thompson," Sarah said as the team gathered around the briefing table. "I didn't expect to see you here." Thompson smiled, looking more confident than she remembered. "You taught me a lot during that firefight, Lieutenant. I figured I could learn even more working with this team. Plus, someone needs to watch your back on these dangerous missions." Their first mission briefing came from a colonel Sarah didn't recognize, probably from Military Intelligence or Special Operations Command. The target was a high-value enemy commander who had been responsible for planning several major attacks against coalition forces. Intelligence indicated he would be attending a meeting in a remote mountain village in 2 days. "This individual has been our #1 priority for 6 months, the colonel explained, while pointing to satellite photographs of the target area. "He's extremely dangerous and well protected. Previous attempts to capture him have failed because he has excellent intelligence about our operations. The mission would require Sarah's team to insert by helicopter under cover of darkness, conduct surveillance on the target location, and either capture the enemy commander or eliminate him if capture wasn't possible. They would have to operate independently for up to 72 hours in hostile territory, with no backup available." Sarah studied the mission details carefully. The target village was located in extremely difficult terrain, surrounded by mountains and accessible only by a few narrow trails. The enemy commander would have at least 20 guards with him, possibly more. Her team would be outnumbered 4 to 1, operating in unfamiliar territory against an enemy who knew the local terrain perfectly. But Sarah also recognized the strategic importance of the mission. This enemy commander had been responsible for the deaths of dozens of coalition soldiers and hundreds of civilians. Eliminating him would significantly disrupt enemy operations throughout the region and save countless lives. "When do we deploy?" Sarah asked after reviewing all the mission materials. "Tomorrow night," the colonel replied. "You have 24 hours to plan your operation and prepare your equipment. Any questions?" Sarah's mind was already working through the tactical challenges. They would need to approach the village from an unexpected direction, establish observation posts without being detected, and coordinate their assault precisely to maximize their chances of success. It would be the most complex and dangerous mission of her military career. That afternoon, Sarah worked with her team to develop a detailed operational plan. Each team member contributed their specialized knowledge to solve different aspects of the mission. Davis planned the approach route that would avoid known enemy observation posts. Foster worked out communication procedures and backup signals. Kim studied satellite imagery to identify the best surveillance positions. Thompson focused on escape and evasion routes they could use if the mission went wrong. His quiet demeanor masked an exceptional tactical mind that could analyze terrain and predict enemy movements with remarkable accuracy. Sarah realized that the farm boy from Kansas had developed into one of the most capable soldiers she had ever worked with. By evening, they had a solid plan that addressed every foreseeable contingency. Sarah felt confident in her team's abilities, but she also understood the risks they were taking. Special operations missions had higher casualty rates than regular combat operations, and this particular mission would place them in extreme danger. That night, Sarah wrote letters to her family back home, just as she had before every dangerous mission. She didn't mention the specifics of what she would be doing, but she wanted them to know how much they meant to her. Military life required constant preparation for the possibility that any mission might be your last. The next evening, Sarah and her team boarded a specially modified helicopter for the flight to their insertion point. The aircraft was equipped with advanced navigation systems and noise reduction technology that would allow them to approach the target area undetected. The pilots were special operations aircrew with extensive experience in high-risk missions. During the flight, Sarah reviewed the mission one final time with her team. Everyone knew their individual responsibilities and understood how their actions contributed to the overall success of the operation. They had trained together intensively for weeks, developing the teamwork and communication necessary for this type of complex mission. As the helicopter approached the insertion point, Sarah felt the familiar combination of excitement and apprehension that came before every combat mission. But this time was different. She was no longer the young lieutenant who questioned whether she was ready for combat leadership. She had proven herself under the most difficult circumstances and earned the respect of soldiers who had served much longer than she had. The helicopter touched down in a small clearing about 5 kilometers from the target village. Sarah and her team quickly unloaded their equipment and moved to a predetermined rally point while the aircraft departed immediately to avoid detection. Within minutes, they were alone in enemy territory, with only their skills and teamwork to rely on. Sarah checked her watch and whispered into her radio microphone. "Base, this is Team Alpha. We are on the ground and beginning movement to target. Next scheduled communication in 6 hours. The response came back immediately. Team Alpha, this is Base. Acknowledged. Weather conditions remain favorable. No change to enemy situation. Good hunting. Sarah smiled grimly as she led her team into the darkness. Tomorrow, they would either complete one of the most important missions of the war or become casualties themselves. But either way, she knew they would give everything they had to accomplish their objective. Behind her, Thompson and the rest of her team moved silently through the mountainous terrain, following the route they had memorized from satellite photographs. Each soldier carried specialized equipment designed for this specific mission, along with enough supplies to survive independently for several days, if necessary. As they disappeared into the night, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since that first convoy escort mission months ago. She had evolved from a young officer trying to prove herself into a confident leader responsible for some of the most dangerous and important operations in the theater of war. But more importantly, she had learned that true leadership wasn't about being the strongest or most aggressive soldier. It was about making sound decisions under pressure, taking care of your people, and accomplishing the mission regardless of the obstacles you faced. Tonight, all of those lessons would be tested again in the mountains of Kazara, where Sarah Martinez and her team would write another chapter in their ongoing war against an enemy that threatened everything they had sworn to protect. The mission ahead would be dangerous, but Sarah was ready. She had been tested by fire and emerged stronger, and now she would use that strength to protect others and serve her country with honor. The mountains ahead held unknown dangers, but they also held the opportunity to make a real difference in the outcome of the war. Sarah and her team moved forward into the darkness, carrying with them the hopes and prayers of everyone who depended on their success. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they were exactly where they needed to be, doing exactly what they had trained to do. In the distance, the lights of the target village flickered like stars against the mountainside. Unaware that 5 American soldiers were approaching through the darkness, ready to risk everything to complete their mission and protect the innocent people who depended on their courage and sacrifice.